Hello everyone and welcome back to Tea Time Thoughts. I'm Kaylin as always, and today as I drink a cup of cran raspberry tea, which I realized recently I kind of forgotten to tell you guys what kind of tea I've been drinking, but anyway, for the past few episodes basically it's been just cranberry raspberry tea because I got hooked on it because it's one of the only teas that I have at work that I really enjoy, and I've been drinking a lot of tea at work lately because I got an internship at a historic house, which anybody who works in museums tends to know that historic houses don't always have the best heating, and if I don't have those cups of tea, then I will likely freeze to death. So not only does cranberry raspberry taste good, but it also saves my life on a regular basis, so much appreciated. Anyway, so today we're finally going to make good on my very long-awaited promise that I would talk about The Great Gatsby. So today we're talking about The Great Gatsby. So without any further ado, we're going to dive right into the subject. Much like Gatsby dove into his pool, except spoiler alert, we're actually going to come up alive. And if that doesn't set the tone for this episode, then I don't know what else will. So in case by some very slim chance you've never heard of The Great Gatsby, The Great Gatsby is a 1925 novel by American author F. Scott Fitzgerald. This novel is set in the Jazz Age on Long Island near New York City, and it depicts the story of Nick Carraway and his life and interactions with mysterious millionaire Jay Gatsby and Gatsby's undying obsession to reunite with his former flame Daisy Buchanan. So, I read The Great Gatsby of my own volition when I was 16. This actually wasn't for a school project, and when I finished it, I didn't like it at the time, and I don't really know why, because I read it again when I was 20 for an American literature class, and I really enjoyed it. But odds are, even if you haven't read the book for yourself, you've no doubt heard the name of The Great Gatsby at some point in some kind of conversation, or even just in some kind of passing meme. Honestly, SparkNotes memes have been popping off lately, but even if you haven't read the book, there's also a possibility that you have something of an idea of the story, because at the very least you could just make some comment about how the book represents the futility of the American dream, and you'd be able to just slide through the conversation pretty unscathed. So people call this book in particular the Great American Novel, but what makes The Great Gatsby so great? I'm sorry, I do apologize. I think that's the only time I'll be making that joke, though, so we're just going to carry on. So to start off, I'm just going to briefly summarize The Great Gatsby. So the story is... The motorcycle man has reappeared. No. Anyway, so I'm just going to start off with a summary of The Great Gatsby. So The Great Gatsby is a story that's told from the perspective of Nick Carraway, who's looking back on his past. In 1922, Nick moved to New York during the rise of the Jazz Age in order to make a career for himself in bonds. Nick lives on the West Egg across from the East Egg, which is filled with very large mansions filled with wealthy people, including Tom Buchanan and his wife Daisy, who also happens to be Nick's cousin. And Nick also meets his love interest for the story, Jordan Baker, who's a professional golfer. And within the beginning, everybody kind of confides in Nick with their secrets. Tom confesses that he has a mistress named Myrtle, and also that he's basically a white supremacist, but he's honestly not that ashamed about it, so it's really not much of a secret. Daisy confesses that she feels kind of stifled in her marriage, and there's a lot to chew on there. So when Nick goes home that night, while he's in his thoughts, he catches a glimpse of his mysterious neighbor, Jay Gatsby, looking out at a green light from the end of a dock. And one day out in the city, where things are much less glamorous than the East Egg, Nick accompanies Tom to visit his mistress Myrtle. We also meet Myrtle's husband, Wilson, who's basically considered kind of a bum. Tom brings Myrtle with them into the city, and they bring along Myrtle's sister as well, and they have a party. Nick gets drunk. At one point, Myrtle starts taunting Tom about Daisy, and Tom responds by hitting her, and it's just a very wild affair. One day, Nick receives an invitation to one of these luxurious parties that are hosted by none other than his neighbor Gatsby, and he goes over, and it's a wild one. And what's even more wild are the rumors about Gatsby. No one can ever truly agree on where Gatsby and his vast fortune come from. At this party, Nick finally meets his neighbor for the first time, and they basically begin to start hanging out after that. And he spins this wild tale for Nick about how he went to Oxford and received medals from multiple countries during the First World War, and he seems to provide proof of all this too. Nick also meets one of Gatsby's acquaintances, a man named Meyer Wolfsheim, who is shown to be kind of shady, which makes Nick suspect Gatsby's connections as well as Gatsby himself. And the story thickens when Nick sees Jordan Baker at lunch, and he finds out that Gatsby has actually been in love with Daisy and has been since before she was married to Tom, and that Daisy almost didn't get married to Tom due to her love for Gatsby. And Jordan has been asked by Gatsby to ask Nick to set up a casual meeting between himself and Daisy, with Nick just conveniently being there. Now, I was wondering, why not cut out the extra link and just ask Nick in general? But honestly, the more you read about Gatsby and question his choices, the more you're like, this was one of the most minor, strange decisions that he made, so I'll just set that down. So Nick does arrange this meeting between Daisy and Gatsby, and when Daisy walks in, Gatsby is suddenly not there. But it's okay, he just ran out in the rain for a second, but he's all back now and ready to look at his crush in person. The high school of it all. But for the most part, Daisy and Gatsby seem to be hitting it off again once they get past that initial awkward reunion. And Nick later tells us the true story of Jay Gatsby, or rather James Gatz, who grew up on a North Dakota farm and dropped out of a university in Minnesota. He then went on to become the assistant of a man with a luxurious yacht, and he was meant to receive a small fortune from this man, but he was prevented from receiving it, and thus he became dedicated to becoming wealthy because he had had a taste for this lifestyle and wanted it for himself. One day, things all come to a head when Nick goes to meet Tom and Daisy for lunch, and he steps in and realizes that both Gatsby and Jordan are there, and things get explosive. Tom realizes that Daisy and Gatsby are in love, and they have a big confrontation. Tom accuses Gatsby of lying and running a bootlegging operation. Gatsby's telling Tom that Daisy's not in love with Tom, she's in love with him, etc. But Daisy, in the middle of it all, even though she's had these powerful feelings for Gatsby, she's edging somewhat closer to Tom. On the way home, Nick, Tom, and Jordan drive home in one car, and Daisy and Gatsby ride home in the other. When the first car arrives home, they find out that there's been a motor accident, and Myrtle, Tom's mistress, has been hit by a yellow car that just so happened to be Gatsby's yellow car. Gatsby later tells Nick that Daisy was actually the one driving when they hit Myrtle, but he plans on taking the blame. And Nick then sees that Tom and Daisy have reconciled with each other, and that Gatsby's plan to kind of win over Daisy again after all this time really has come to naught. So the last time that Nick sees Gatsby, Gatsby tells him the truth about his life and that he was too poor to marry Daisy, and the things that Tom had accused him of were true. He actually did make his money from bootlegging. And while Gatsby's waiting for a call from Daisy, Wilson, Myrtle's husband, has found out from Tom that Gatsby was responsible for her death, supposedly. They know at least that it was Gatsby's car. So Wilson goes to Gatsby, who he finds swimming in a pool, and shoots him before turning the gun on himself. And Tom and Daisy eventually leave the area, and Nick is left to arrange the funeral, which is attended by only 2 people, including Gatsby's father. Nick then decides to move back to the Midwest to get away from the once luxurious but now distasteful life of the city. Okay, so now that the summary is complete, we're going to dig into the deeper meaning and analysis behind F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. And I'll get into that after this.
Hello, this is the History of Cologne podcast. Cologne is a city in Western Germany, and it's 2,000 years old. Cologne's history serves so well as a microcosm of European history. So if you're sick and tired maybe of hearing history from the perspective of Rome, Paris or London, stick around. Expect a journey through times with the ancient Romans, Cologne as Germany's biggest city in the Middle Ages, and the question, was Cologne really holy as it said it was? How did the people live here through the ages, and is it true that Cologne has so many churches that you can visit each day another church all year long, never going to the same church again? How did Cologne enter the modern era of European history? Were the citizens of Cologne in favor of Nazism? And how come that Cologne still exists despite the fact that it was totally destroyed in World War II? And this podcast will not only be a chronology, no, I will list up socioeconomic topics, biographies, and even parts about architecture. And not to forget sagas and myths, and Cologne being 2,000 years old has a lot of sagas and myths. So I hope to hear from you very soon again, so stick around, and till then, auf Wiedersehen!
And now, back to the story. Do bear in mind that literary analysis is something that is very much up for interpretation. So one person could read The Great Gatsby and think of something entirely different to the person next to them. So what I'm just going to do for you guys here is simply present some common interpretations and analyses. So on the surface level, we have this very glamorous rags to riches story from Gatsby. But once we dig into the story further, we realize that when you have all the money the world has to offer, it doesn't mean that you're going to be problem-free. There's still going to be conflict. Something that is constantly associated with The Great Gatsby is the concept of the American dream, which is basically the belief that anyone, regardless of their background or class or birth, can achieve their goals. But if you've heard anyone talk about The Great Gatsby for more than 2 seconds, then you get the idea that the American dream is actually dead. Gone, past, deceased, dead. And the reason we make this association between Gatsby and the American dream has been addressed by the work of Roger Pearson, who wrote an article entitled Gatsby, False Prophet of the American Dream for the English Journal. And in this work, Pearson points out that this dream of rising the ranks has been prevalent since the origins of colonial America, where indentured servants came to a new land full of opportunity and the promise that if they worked hard, they would receive transport, property, a whole new life ahead of them, etc. Now, going back to the story, one primary conflict in the story is the difference between those located on the East Egg, where Tom and Daisy live, and on the West Egg, where Nick and Gatsby live. Those in the East tend to be those who are born into wealth, while those in the West tend to be those who had to work their way into wealth. And because Gatsby, from the West, doesn't have the blue blood making of the others, he's subject to rumors and also very much frowned upon by the likes of Tom, and even to a degree by Daisy, who ultimately decided that she wouldn't be with Gatsby because he wasn't wealthy enough all those years ago. So even though Gatsby is trying so hard to rise up, he's still nouveau riche, and he's being judged because of his birth, even though he's in a system where supposedly there are no class distinctions and everyone can be whatever class they aspire to be. There are still these unspoken barriers that prevent any true progress. And Pearson points out how F. Scott Fitzgerald's portrayal of the American dream is different because it displays the dream with more pessimism and possibly more realism. Pearson says with his final line, quote, "The American dream is, in reality, a nightmare," end quote. And this is something that F. Scott Fitzgerald made poignant with his story, with these various goals of different characters in the novel. Ultimately, all these goals and dreams are never truly satisfied. Gatsby's dream of being with Daisy ultimately ends up leading to his death, and Nick's dream of going out to the East Coast and becoming a finance guru ends with him being disgusted with that way of life and moving back west. So now that we've established kind of the main analysis / interpretation behind the story, we're going to dig into some more of the smaller plot lines and significant topics such as race and gender roles. So regarding the role of race in the novel, two of the biggest implications of the story regarding race are, first, Tom's mention of this book called The Rise of Colored Empires, which was actually Fitzgerald referencing a real book called The Rising Tide of Color by Lothrop Stoddard, which is a book that discusses various threats to white supremacy. Like Stoddard, Tom is against immigration and asserts that he and his immediate circle status are racially superior as Nordics. But what's interesting is that because we don't see specific examples of immigrants in the story, Tom demonstrates this prejudice by judging Gatsby and being suspicious of his origins. He basically kind of views Gatsby as a sort of immigrant due to his change in station throughout his life, because change is the thing that threatens Tom the most. And the second instance that sparks some debate about the role of race in the book is the character of Meyer Wolfsheim, who is explicitly stated to be a Jewish man in connection to some shady business, such as fixing the 1919 World Series in his favor. There are even some explicit references to the shape of his nose in the description of his character. The character of Wolfsheim represents a character stereotype of the Jewish miser, akin to the like of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. Some people claim that Wolfsheim's presence in the book creates a sense of anti-Semitism within the novel, while others claim that Wolfsheim's character is harmless and unpolitical and just a representation of the times. Apparently, F. Scott Fitzgerald himself was so upset by the allegations of anti-Semitism in his novel and claimed explicitly that Wolfsheim, quote, fulfilled a function in the story and had nothing to do with race or religion, end quote. So another sub-analysis within the story that we previously mentioned is that of gender roles and relations. So the female figure that's prevalent throughout the 1920s is that of the flapper. The archetype of the flapper is some girl with a fashionable, boyish figure in a shortened dress, a bob haircut, and blush on her cheeks and her knees. And these girls were no strangers to a good time. They were regularly partaking of alcohol and even premarital sex, which was so scandalous because nobody had ever done that before. Okay, sarcasm aside, it was just becoming more widespread than before. That's why it was so notable. That's why we look back at it in history as this somewhat liberation time period for women. So Jordan and Daisy both fall into this somewhat glamorous flapper category, being able to partake in life's pleasures, but they're also still restricted by these invisible boundaries as well, particularly Daisy is. Because Daisy, even though she is a main character in the novel and revolves around this very important plot point when it comes to Gatsby's desire to relive this aspect of the past, she still has little of her own agency, and more of the men around her, either Tom or Gatsby, are usually pulling her around or telling her what to do. And one of the telling phrases at the beginning of the story is spoken by Daisy when she speaks to Nick about her newborn baby girl. She says that she's glad that her baby is a girl and that she hopes she'll be a fool. Quote, "I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool." And that particular line has definitely been pointed out and analyzed so often over the years. Why be a fool? Why would you want to be a fool? Isn't a fool something that's bad to be? Well, if you're a fool, you don't have to think outside the confines of life. You don't have to stir up any trouble. Even though there's this seemingly grand freedom for women during the Roaring '20s, Fitzgerald used his female characters to somewhat demonstrate the restrictions that still bound women during these times. Even though we often look to the 1920s as this period of liberation and boldness for women, it's just not something that was truly as free as we imagine it to be. Daisy ultimately lives within the confines of these rules and takes the path of least resistance at the end and clings to Tom. Even when Daisy hits Myrtle with Gatsby's car near the end of the book, she's still the one that can get away without blame. The blame goes entirely to Gatsby because a pretty little fool is unlikely to be held responsible. Now, lastly, the novel discusses the aspect of living in the past or recreating the past. That's one thing that people tend to criticize Gatsby for a lot, is his desire to live in the past or recreate these things from before. And we could easily stem that back to Pearson's analysis of the original American ideals of coming over and, with the work of your own two hands, rising the ranks. If Gatsby had lived in another era, then these dreams and ambitions of him might have been more successful, but something about time has changed. Something about the world we live in is that it constantly changes. And even though Gatsby might have had success in another life or another timeline, for whatever reason, the world in which he lives is not one that will allow him to achieve this dream. There's no way you can hit rewind. There's always going to have to be some sort of reckoning with the time in front of you. So overall, what are we supposed to get from The Great Gatsby? We have these questionings of the American dream. We have questionings of the value of the past and how dangerous trying to live for the past can be. We have these observations about race and gender. What are we supposed to ultimately draw from all of this? And that's something that I know it's not always fun to end on an open-ended note, but the meaning that you derive from The Great Gatsby is something that's ultimately up for interpretation. Even though we associate the period of the 1920s with rose-colored glasses and view it as this time period just filled to the brim with freedom for women, freedom for people looking to rise through the ranks, we need to look closer at how authentic this freedom actually is and what the true cost of our dreams are. So that's it for today. Thank you guys so much for listening, and it feels good to finally not have the Great Gatsby episode hanging over my head anymore. I've been promising it for way too long, but I am very grateful to you guys again for listening. And if you like this episode, please feel free to like, comment, follow, subscribe. Every platform is a little bit different. You can also leave a rating for my podcast on ratethispodcast.com/teatimethoughts. It really does help to boost the podcast, so I I really appreciate it when you guys are willing to do that. Be sure to check out my YouTube and Instagram pages. Both are at Tea Time Thoughts Podcast, and if I do say so myself, my Instagram is quite fun. I enjoy sharing some good kicks and giggles with you guys, and it's also the place that I can most easily interact with my listeners. So if you ever have any ideas for future episodes, or you just have any comments you would like to share, or thoughts that you have, I'd be very happy to hear them, and I'd be very happy to have some recommendations for future episodes as well. And don't forget to tune in next week when I talk about my movie review for the new 2021 blockbuster film Spencer. And trust me, it's a doozy, so you're going to want to tune in for this one. Anyway, so thank you very much for listening. This is Tea Time Thoughts, and I'll talk to you next time.